Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today, insha'Allah ta'ala, we're going to continue from where we stopped last class. And today, insha'Allah ta'ala, we're going to learn as much as we can. We're going to learn very important points, insha'Allah ta'ala, about fasting. We're going to learn the things that are mandatory for fasting and the things that might break one's fasting. So, the author, Imam Ibn Annaqib, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shower his mercy on him, said, وَلَوْ قَامَتِ الْبَيِّنَةُ بِالرُّؤْيَةِ يَوْمَ الشَّكِّ وَجَبَ إمساك بقيته وقضاؤه. First of all, we need to learn what is Yawm al-Shak. Yawm al-Shak is the day number 30 of the month of Sha'ban, but it's not called Yawm al-Shak, a day of doubt, unless one or more people would say that this is a day of Ramadan. But the one who said that, his witness is not actually considered, because they might be young kids or slaves or things whose witness is not accepted. So if people have spoken, or have said, some people whose witness is not accepted have claimed that this is a day of Ramadan, so it is the day number 30, but it's not proven actually, so people wouldn't fast. People wouldn't fast, are not permitted to fast. It is impermissible to fast that day. However, if they are in the morning after the day has started, while they haven't started fasting, and if someone came from a neighboring town, for example, that is close to them, and he said that we have sighted the moon last night, and this is a day of the month of Ramadan, and you were supposed to fast that day. In this case, it is mandatory for them to abstain from food and drink and all the things that may violate their fasting until the end of that day. So they have to fast the rest of that day. However, they will also have to make it up, because they now know for sure that it is a day of the month of Ramadan, that Sha'ban was only 29 days, and that Ramadan has already started. And then he says, وَيُؤْمَرُ الصَّبِيُّ بِهِ لِسَبْعٍ. The young kid, by the age of 7 years, should be ordered, should be commanded to fast. Of course, if he has discernment. وَيُضْرَبُ لِعَشْرٍ. And by the age of 10, when a kid gets the age of 10, he has to, or his dad, for example, might beat him, but slightly beat him, or just to rebuke him, try to encourage him to fast by the age of 10 years old. Because if he reached that age and he is still not used to fast, it would be hard for them to get familiar and used to fast. So they are highly encouraged to start fasting even if they are still young. And fasting in this case would be commendable for them. They get rewards for doing that, but they are not punished for doing that. And also, it will be in the scales of good deeds for their parents. And then he says, وَيُبِيحُ الْفِطْرَ. So these are the excuses. Now we're going to speak about the excuses for not fasting, or for breaking one's fasting. غَلَبَةُ الْجُوعِ وَالْعَطَشِ بِحَيْثُ يَخْشَى الْهَلَاكَ وَالْمَرَضَ. That if someone has excessive, that's too much hunger or thirst, that he is afraid that he might die or get so much sick out of this hunger or thirst. So in this case, it is permissible, actually not only permissible, it is mandatory for them to break their fasting, and they have to fast another day. So if they are certain that this would harm them, that fasting would harm them, in this case, it is mandatory for them to break their fasting and make it up. وَلَوْ طَرَأَ فِي أَثْنَاءِ الْيَوْمِ إِذَا شَقَّ الصَّوْمُ. That if someone has already started fasting, but then this happened to them suddenly, that they started to feel too much tired, or they feel that they would get so sick, or that they might endanger their own lives. In this case, it is not only permissible for them, but if they are afraid that they would really die, in this case, it is mandatory for them to break their fasting, and they would make it up later. Then also amongst the excuses for not fasting or for breaking someone's fasting is وَسَفَرُ الْقَصْرِ, which is traveling that is for the distance that allows them to shorten their prayers, or more than this distance, which is about 50 miles or 81 or 85 matters. So in this case, the one who is traveling can actually not fast, can take the license of not fasting. But this is actually with some conditions. As he says, إن فارق العمران قبل الفجر وإن نواه من الليل. Like the condition for doing this is that they would leave the town or the city before dawn, before the start of Fajr. وَإِنَّ نَوَاهُ مِنَ اللَّيْلِ, even if that person, that traveler, has intended to fast and had the intention of fasting that day. As long as he has left the town, he has started traveling before Fajr, in this case, they are permitted to break their fasting. فَإِنْ سَافَرَ بَعْدَهُ, meaning that if he has started traveling and he left the town after Fajr, after dawn, after the fasting time has started, in this case, فَلَا, they are not allowed to break their fasting because of just traveling. But they might break their fasting for some other reason. As we said, if they got too much tired, if they get excessively tired, because most of the acts of worship has some kind of, like, they would cause tired to some people, but this is not considered actually to be an excuse. The real excuse has to be something that is excessive, something that is more than usual. Then he said, وَالْفِطْرُ لِلْمُسَافِرِ أَفْضَلُ إِنْ ضَرَّهُ الصَّوْمُ وَإِلَّا فَالصَّوْمُ أَفْضَلُ. Now we move on to a point that is also important. Some people might be wondering which is better, to fast during traveling or not to fast. And it is actually a point of, it depends on each and every person. If someone would get harmed by this fasting during traveling, in this case, breaking his or her fasting is better for them. As the Prophet ﷺ has said, لَيْسَ مِنَ الْبِرِّ الصِّيَامُ فِي السَّفَرِ. It is not out of righteousness, an act of righteousness, to fast while traveling. However, if someone is strong enough, they don't get tired when they fast during travel, in this case, they can fast. And actually fasting in this case is better for them. And then he says, وَلَوْ خَافَتْ حَامِلٌ أو مرضع على نفسهما أو على ولديهما أفطرتا وقضتا. If a pregnant woman or a woman who breastfeeds her babies, if they are afraid that they could get harmed, they themselves, their own selves, the moms themselves, or they would be afraid that their babies could be harmed by their fasting, in this case, it is permissible for them to break their fasting, and then they would make up that day by fasting another day. However, لكن تفديان عند الخوف على الولد لكل يوم مد. But in case they broke their fast out of the fear only for the babies, not for their own selves, in this case, in addition to making up that day, they would have to also make fidya, which is giving a charity an amount of food, common food in that country, like 550 grams of rice, for example, for every day that they would break their fasting. And this is only in the case that they would break their fasting out of the fear, not for their own selves, but only for their babies or some other wealth or animal, to protect some wealth or to protect some animal or so. And the reason for making fidya is actually because they have, although they have made up that day through fasting that another day, however, they have missed the reward, the great reward of fasting that day during the month of Ramadan. We know that the rewards in the month of Ramadan are too many, to whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will double, multiply the rewards for people. So because they have missed the reward of fasting that great day of the month of Ramadan during the month of Ramadan, they can still have that reward through the fidya. And then he said, وَلَا يَجِبُ صَوْمُ رَمَضَانَ إِلَّا بِرُؤْيَةِ الْهِلَالِ. That when Sha'ban is 29 days, if it's the 29th day, the following day shouldn't be fasted. It's permissible to fast it unless the moon is sighted, the moon of the new month. فَإِنْ غُمَّ, if people are unable to see, to sight the moon, وجب استكمال شعبان 30 ثم يصومون. In this case, if the moon is not sighted on the 29th day of the month of Sha'ban, in this case, we have to consider the month of Sha'ban to be 30 days. And then we start fasting Ramadan from the following day. وَإِنْ رُؤِيَ نَهَارًا فَهُوَ لِلَّيْلَةِ الْمُسْتَقْبَلَةِ. That if the moon is sighted in the morning, now we have after it is the 29th day of the month of Sha'ban, and people didn't sight the moon. However, in the morning, they have sighted the moon. What should they do in this case? Is it considered to be the moon of the previous night, and they were supposed to fast that day, or it is for the new day? The answer is that actually whenever the moon is sighted during the day, that moon is actually for the following night, for the next one, not for the past night. وَإِنْ رُؤِيَ فِي بَلَدٍ دُونَ بَلَدٍ. What if the moon is sighted in some country, but the other country has not sighted that moon? What should they do in this case? He said, فَإِنْ تَقَارَبَ عَمَّ الْحُكْمُ وَإِلَّا فَلَا. If these two countries are close to one another, in this case, the country which, or the city or the town which didn't sighted the moon has to follow the city or the town that has sighted the moon, and they have to start fasting like that. وَإِلَّا, meaning that if they are not close to one another, in this case, each of the country would rely on their own sighting. Like, how do we know whether the countries are close to one another or not? He said, وَالْبُعْدُ بِاخْتِلَافِ الْمَطَالِعِ كَالْحِجَازِ وَالْعِرَاقِ وَمِصْرَ وَقِيلَ بِمَسَافَةِ الْقَصْرِ. He said that being far or close for the towns from being far or close to one another, this actually depends on the matala, the places of the sun rise. Like, for example, the latitudes, actually. Earth has longitudes and latitudes. And the earth, the sun rises up from the east into the west. So the places like the neighboring countries or neighboring cities or towns during which the sun or the moon would rise at similar times, in this case, they would be close and they have to follow each other. The one who would sight the moon, the others has to follow it. وَقِيلَ, we said at the very beginning that he would use the term وَقِيلَ when he refers to the non-accredited opinion. And typically, he quotes Imam al-Rafi'i. And the accredited opinion will be for Imam al-Nawawi, may Allah shower His mercy upon them. So he says, وَقِيلَ بِمَسَافَةِ الْقَصْرِ. That Imam al-Rafi'i has said that we should consider the distance of shortened prayer, which is about 81 kilometers. If the neighboring towns are closer to one another, less than 81 kilometers, in this case, they have to follow each other in sighting the moon. But if the distance between them is more than this, they don't have to follow each other. How many people do we need for witnessing the sighting the moon? He says, وَيُقْبَلُ فِي هِلَالِ رَمَضَانَ بِالنِّسْبَةِ إِلَى الصَّوْمِ عَدْلٌ وَاحِدٌ ذَكَرٌ حُرٌّ مُكَلَّفٌ. So he says that sighting the moon for the month of Ramadan, only for fasting, meaning that for the start of fasting, this is actually just for this act of worship, not for anything as like, for example, if someone has a debt for somebody else and he says, I'll give you that debt, in this case, the start of the month of Ramadan for that person would require to have 2 witnesses, not only one. But only for the fasting of the month of Ramadan, it is sufficient to have عدل واحد ذكر حر مكلف. عدل means that an upright person he who is not known for being defiantly disobedient. واحد, the only one, is sufficient. If there are more, that is good. ذكر, that it is a male. This is actually like different from the conditions for narration for the adl in riwayah. We have two types of adl. Adl for shahada and the adl for riwayah. Adl of shahada has to be a male. For a riwayah, it can be female. And for also a riwayah, the adl of a riwayah, he can do the tahammul, the listening or witnessing an incident while he is still young. But the delivery of this narration has to be when he reaches puberty. Mukallafun, meaning that he is sane, he has reached puberty, and he is also sane. وَلَا يُقْبَلُ فِي سَائِرِ الشُّهُورِ إِلَّا عَدْلًا. And in the other months, including the month of Shawwal, that means the end of the month of Ramadan, is not cited. The minimum number for people who would cite the moon and who would witness that they have sighted the moon, the minimum has to be 2 upright persons, because this is the minimum number that is required for witnessing in general. Generally speaking, for any witness, there has to be the minimum number 2 people. And that is also true for all the months, including the start of the month of Shawwal. What about the beginning of Ramadan? Why should we only, if one person, if an upright person has sighted the moon and he has witnessed by using the phrase of ashhadu, if he does so, if he used that phrase, we would all follow him, because this is what the Prophet ﷺ has done, especially with this month, with the month of Ramadan. And then we have some other cases like وَلَوْ عَرَفَ رَجُلٌ بِالْحِسَابِ وَالنُّجُومِ أَنَّ غَدًا مِنْ رَمَضَانَ لَمْ يَجِبِ الصَّوْمُ لكن يجوز للحاسب والمنجم فقط. Now, if someone uses calculations, knows the positions for stars, that this star would be here when it's the month of so, if someone uses such calculations and he comes out with the conclusion that tomorrow will be the first day of Ramadan, it is not mandatory neither for his own self nor for other people to fast that day. However, it is permissible only for that person to fast that day. Like if that day could be either the 30th day of Sha'ban or the first day of Ramadan. In this case, only for that person who would use such calculations is permissible to fast that day his own self. Other people are not permitted to fast like him or to follow him. And then he says, وَإِنِ اشْتَبَهَتِ الشُّهُورُ عَلَى أَسِيرٍ وَنَحْوِهِ اجْتَهَدَ وُجُوبًا وَصَامَ. That if someone is taken as a captive and he is kept like in a dark room, he couldn't see the moon, he couldn't sight the moon, and he didn't know actually whether Ramadan has started or not yet, or even what months that he is kept by non-Muslims, for example. In this case, he has to try his best to come to the conclusion about the start and the end of the month of Ramadan. And then he has to follow his ijtihad. However, after he is freed or so, فَإِنِ اسْتَمَرَّ الْإِشْكَالُ أو وافق رمضان أو ما بعده صح. After he is over with this, in this case, he could either be still in doubt, he didn't know whether the month that for example, he has fasted already 30 days, but he is not sure whether he has fasted these days during the month of Ramadan or even after the month of Ramadan, or he has fasted them before the month of Ramadan. If he is still uncertain, in this case, his fasting is valid. He is not mandated to make it up. Even if he knew that he has fasted some days during the month of Ramadan and other days during the month of Shawwal, as long as he fasted days either at the month of Ramadan or after Ramadan, his fast is valid. But if he fasted the whole month, or even some of the days that he thought or that he presumed to be of Ramadan, and then he found out for sure that it wasn't Ramadan, it was before Ramadan, in this case, لم يصح. He has to make it up. He has to fast other days. And those days that he already fasted would be considered to be commendable, to be sunnah for him. However, if he missed a few years, not only 1 year, if he missed some Ramadans, he would have to make up only one Ramadan. And the others that he made will be considered to be make up for the other previous years. Then he says, وَشَرْطُ الصَّوْمِ. He says shartu, which means conditions. However, he means pillar, he means rukn of as-sawm. Although he says shartu as-sawm, but he uses that term while he means the pillars of fasting, the parts of fasting, things that are mandatory for fasting to be valid. The first of these pillars of fasting is an-niyatu, which is intention. And the second one is al-imsaku anil mufattirati, to abstain from all things which could break someone's fast. He says, فَيَنْوِي لِكُلِّ يَوْمٍ فَإِنْ كَانَ فَرْضًا وَجَبَ تَعْيِينُهُ. That making intention is mandatory for every day of fasting. Every day before dawn, everyone has to make an intention that they are fasting that day. And they have to make that intention during night. And the night starts from the sunset. So during the period of from the sunset of the previous day into the dawn, they can make intention. So it is mandatory to make intention for every day according to the Shafi'i madhab. However, it is also commendable to follow or to make an intention on the very first night of the month of Ramadan that you are fasting the whole month, as we are like we might follow the Imam or the school of Imam Malik in this issue, so that in case we have forgot to make an intention on some night, our fasting will be still valid, insha'Allah ta'ala. So how to make intention for the fasting the month of Ramadan? He says, فَإِنْ كَانَ فَرْضًا, if that fasting is mandatory, whether it's fasting the month of Ramadan or it's has vowed to a fast someday, or it's expiation fasting, whatever, as long as it's a mandatory fast, وَجَبَ تَعْيِينُهُ, he has to specify what fasting is he doing. Is he or she doing the month of Ramadan, or are they fasting an expiation, or it's a vow fasting? And it's also mandatory to make tabit and niyyah, that you have to make the intention at the night that is before that day. So these two things are mandatory, that they have to specify, they have to do or to decide whether they are fasting Ramadan or fasting expiation, or it's a vow fasting, and they have to make the intention at night. وَأَكْمَلُهُ, and the best way to make intention, however, not all these things are mandatory. أَنْ يَنْوِيَ صَوْمَ غَدٍ عَنْ أَدَاءِ فَرْضِ رَمَضَانَ هَذِهِ السَّنَةِ لِلَّهِ تَعَالَى. To make an intention, the best way to make intention, perfect way to make intention, is to make intention that you are fasting tomorrow, and it's a current performance. It's ada'an, not qada'an. You are doing that day, you are fasting that day as a current performance for Fard Ramadan, or fasting that day, which is Ramadan, and to also make intention that it is Fard, it is mandatory. However, making the intention that it is mandatory is not necessary, because fasting Ramadan is always mandatory. هذه السنة, it is also better to specify that you are fasting that day for this year. لله تعالى, also making intention that you are making that fast for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like you are expecting the reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. We said that this is the best way to make intention. However, not all of these things are mandatory. What is mandatory is that you just say, I am fasting. Of course, you don't have to utter this word with your tongue, as intention is made by the heart. So anyone want to make intention has to just make intention that they are fasting the day of tomorrow as a fasting a month Ramadan of Ramadan. ولو أخبره بالرؤية ليلة الشك من يثق به ممن لا يقبله الحاكم من نسوة وعبيد وصبيان فنوى بناء على ذلك كان منه صح. Now someone whose wife, for example, or his servants or his kids told him that we have sighted the moon, while nobody else have told him that. The whole country didn't sight the moon, but only someone has told him, and that person is not considered to be adl shahada. However, he would trust this person. He would trust this young kid, or would trust this woman, or he would trust this slave. in this case, he is permitted, it is permissible for him. Of course, now we are speaking about the day of doubt, the day that is, it could be the 30 days of the month of Sha'ban, or it could be the first day of the month of Ramadan. So if someone that we said that is not adlu riwayah, if someone whose witness is not accepted, however, he or she would trust that person, in this case, it is permissible for them to fast, or to make an intention to fast that day and consider it the first day of the month of Ramadan. And if it happens that it is proven that was really the first day of the month of Ramadan, in this case, his fast will be valid. His fast will be accepted and valid, although he started the fasting not with a certain intention, because the witness of such persons that we described is not 100% accepted. However, since it was probable for them and he had a partial evidence for this, so in this case, his fast would be accepted, insha'Allah. However, وَإِنْ نَوَاهُ مِنْ غَيْرِ إِخْبَارِ أَحَدٍ فَكَانَ مِنْهُ لَمْ يَصِحْ سَوَاءٌ جَزَمَ النِّيَّةَ أو تردد فقال إن كان رمضان فأنا صائم وإلا فمفطر. But what if someone would fast that day, the day that we said that could be the 30 days of the month of Sha'ban or the first day of the month of Ramadan? If someone has fasted that day and he said, I'm gonna fast that day, I'm sure that it is the first day of the month of Ramadan, while he had no evidence, no upright witness has testified that this day, that he has cited them with, or even saying that I'm gonna fast that day, and if it's the first day of Ramadan, then I'll be fasting. If it's not, I wouldn't be fasting. In both cases, whether he made an intention, a assured intention to fast, or even if he has doubted the intention, that if he says, I'm going to fast if it's the day of Ramadan, if not, I'm not going to fast. In both cases, even if it happened to be the first day of the month of Ramadan, in both cases, his fast is not valid. Why? Because he just presumed it by just intuition. He didn't have a valid or a good evidence for this. However, we have a similar case, but this is at the end of the month of Ramadan. If it's the 30th night or the 30th day of Ramadan, the last day of Ramadan, and he didn't sight the moon. However, nobody has informed him. Whether somebody has informed him that he sighted the moon, or even nobody has informed him, whether that person, his witness is accepted or not. If he said that if tomorrow is one of the Ramadans, if tomorrow is a day of Ramadan, I will be fasting. If not, I'm not going to be fasting. And it happened, he found out that it was a day of Ramadan. In this case, his fast is valid. Why? What's the difference between this case and the other? The difference is for some type of evidence that is called istishab, that it is the main rule or the original rule of that day is that it's a day of Ramadan, because we have been fasting the whole month of Ramadan, and this day is probably one of the days of Ramadan. This is in contrast with the other day, which is the 30 days of Sha'ban, because he wasn't fasting during Sha'ban. He is starting a new rule. So this is the difference between these two cases. That is why, if he has done so, if he made an intention at the end, or at the last day of Ramadan, that if it's a day of Ramadan, I'll be fasting. If not, I'm not going to be fasting. And he found out that it was a day of Ramadan, his fasting will be valid and accepted, insha'Allah ta'ala. All these issues are for the fasting, the mandatory fasting. Then he speaks about the commendable fasting and says, وَيَصِحُّ النَّفْلُ بِنِيَّةٍ مُطْلَقَةٍ قَبْلَ الزَّوَالِ. That for the commendable fasting, any intention for fasting that day, as long as it is before noon, would be accepted. This is for the commendable fasting. So just say, I'm going to fast that day for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm going to just fast that day. Whatever intention he would make, it is accepted, as long as he makes the intention, even not at night, but even as long as it's before noon, it's before the dhuhr time, before the zawal. However, to attain the reward of fasting a specific day, like the day of Arafah, for example, or the day of Ashura, those days, to get their reward, their full reward, you have to make the intention that you are making fast of that great day, by making intention that, oh Allah, I'm going to fast that day, the day of Arafah, for your own sake. Now I'm going to move on to the مفسدات والصوم, the things which could break or violate your fasting. He says, وَإِنْ أَكَلَ أَوْ شَرِبَ أَوْ اسْتَعْطَ أَوْ احْتَقَنَ. That if someone has eats or drinks or استعطى, which means enters food or whatever liquid through his or her nose, أو احتقن, which is using suppositories, those kind of medication that is entered either through anal or even the vaginal. أو صب في أذنه فوصل دماغه, or even through entering any substance through his ear, like a liquid or oil or whatsoever, so it reaches the cavity in his head. أو أدخل إصبعا أو غيره في دبره, or even entering anything into anus or even into the vagina. أو قبلها أو وراء ما يبدو عند القاعدة. So entering any substance, any physical object to these open passageways would break the fasting. أو وصل إلى جوفه شيء من طعنة أو دواء, or even whatever would reach his body cavity, even if it's if someone got stabbed, for example, and he had an open passageway in his body, and through that passageway some substance has entered his body cavity, in this case also his fast will be broken. أو تقيأ, if someone also vomits. We will learn that the vomit that would break the fasting is the deliberate vomiting. But if it happens that someone is overcome by nausea, the vomit happens to him not deliberately, in this case his fast is still valid. أو جامع, having intercourse would also break the fast, and even without orgasm. So having intercourse by just inserting the head of the penis into the vagina would immediately break someone's fast. أو باشر فيما دون الفرج فأنزل, or even making like any skin contact between him and his wife or even any other woman, and it happens that he had orgasm, he has ejaculated, semen has released. This would also violate his fasting. This would break and invalidate his fasting. أو استمنى فأنزل, or even through masturbation, either that masturbation was by himself or by his wife. This would also invalidate the fasting. أو بالغ في مضمضة أو استنشاق فنزل جوفه. If someone is sniffing out his mouth or nose, but then he makes that with abundance, he uses excessive water, so some of the water has slipped into his cavity. In this case, this would also invalidate his fast, and he would have to make up that day. However, if they are not using excessive water, if they didn't use abundance of water, in this case, their fast is still valid, even if some water has slipped into his cavity. أو أخرج ريقه من فمه كما إذا جر الخيط في فمه عند فتله فانفصل عليه ريق ثم رده وبلع ريقه. As you notice, all these things are the things which violate or invalidate someone's fast. So he now speaks about case of even the one's own saliva, if it gets out and separated from his own mouth, if he returns that saliva back into his mouth and it enters his cavity, this would break his fasting. And he makes an example of someone who is threading a needle, for example, and after the thread is wet with his saliva, and then he gets it back again to his mouth, so he would swallow some of that saliva. This would break his fasting. Or even أو بلع ريقه متغيرا كما إذا فتل خيطا فتغير بصبغه. Now, if someone has also swallowed the saliva, but that saliva, his own saliva, was like changed with something, like he was, for example, also threading a needle, and he would put that thread into his mouth to make it wet, but then his saliva is changed by the dye of that thread, so his saliva has been changed. In this case, if he swallowed that saliva, it would break his fasting. This would invalidate his fasting. أو كان نجسا, meaning that if his saliva was impure. كما إذا دمي فمه فبصق حتى صفى ريقه ولم يغسله. Even if his saliva is unchanged, however, it is impure. Because, for example, mouth got hurt and it keeps bleeding. However, the bleed had stopped and he kept spitting that blood until there is no longer blood in his mouth. In this case, his mouth is actually, although could be clean, however, it is not pure, it is not tahir, because the means of purification, according to the Shafi'i madhab, has to be water. He must clean this impurity with a pure water, ma'un tahur. So even if his mouth doesn't have dirt or blood, but it used to be impure because of the incident we just mentioned, if he swallowed his saliva in this case, his saliva would be najis, would be also impure. So this would invalidate his fasting. أو ابتلع نخامة من أقصى الفم وقدر على قطعها ومجها فتركها حتى نزلت. Now we gotta know first what is أقصى الفم. أقصى الفم, scholars say that أقصى الفم is the point of articulating the letter kha. So whatever phlegm or even mucus that came out of that point of articulation, it must be spit. You gotta spit this. If you swallow that, this would invalidate your fasting. أو طلع الفجر وهو يجامع فاستدام ولو لحظة. Also, if the dawn has started, if it's time for fasting while he was having sexual intercourse, in this case, he has to stop at once. If he continues even for a bit of moment, this would invalidate the fast, because fasting has to be fasting a whole day, a full day. وهو في جميع ذلك ذاكر للصوم عالم بالتحريم. Now he is mentioning very important conditions for all these cases that we just mentioned. For all of them to invalidate someone's fast, the person has to be ذاكر للصوم, has to remember, being aware that he or she is fasting. عالم بالتحريم, and he has knowledge that this is impermissible, that this would invalidate his fasting. So this means that he is not aware that he is fasting, has forgot that he is fasting, or that he is not aware, or he doesn't know that this would break his fasting. In this case, it wouldn't break his fasting. It wouldn't invalidate his or her fasting. But if he knows and remembers, بطل صومه وعليه القضاء وإمساك بقية النهار. If he remembers that he is fasting, he knows he is fasting, and he knows that this invalidates the fasting, and he does it deliberately, in this case, his fast is invalid, and he has to do qada, make up that fasting another day as a make-up for that day. He is also commanded to fast for the rest of the day because he has committed an act of disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he has to quit, he has to make a tawbah and quit that disobedience at once by stop eating or drinking or doing whatever. Not just say, oh my God, I have broken my fast, so I gotta just continue and do whatever I please. No, this is not the case. He has to, it is mandatory for them to keep fasting for the rest of the day, although they are going to make up that day. Then he says, وَضَابِطُ الْمُفَطِّرِ. He is now speaking about the criterion for the thing that would really invalidate the fast. He says, وُصُولُ عَيْنٍ. It is like making a summary or a conclusion of all the things that we have spoken about so far. وصول عين وإن قلت من منفذ مفتوح إلى جوف. That any substance, any physical object that would reach the cavity through an open passageway. This means, so the word ayn, which is a substance or a physical object, doesn't mean that, for example, if some smell or a taste, if someone had smelled something or has tasted something, this doesn't mean that this would invalidate. No, it has to be substance. It has to be a physical object. وإن قلت, even if it's just a dust. من منفذ مفتوح. So it has to be an open passageway. It couldn't be like, for example, it couldn't be through the skin pores, for example. If someone had a shower and water has entered his body cavity through the pores of the skin, this wouldn't break his fasting. Or even using the eye drop also wouldn't invalidate someone's fasting, because eyes are not considered to be an open passageway to the body. However, things which can be considered as open passageways include the mouth, the nose, the ears, the anus, the vagina, even the penis, all these, and even the breast, all these are considered to be open passageways. If any substance, whatever little or however little it is, if it's inserted into the body cavity through these open passageways, this would invalidate one's fast. Even if the open passageway is made through a stab, for example, someone who is wounded and something is inserted, like a medicine is inserted through that injury into the body cavity, this would invalidate his fast. والجماع and any sexual intercourse would also invalidate one's fast. And we said that that it is called jima' even without orgasm, even without ejaculation. That once the head of the penis is entered into the vagina, it is called jima' and the fast is broken. والإنزال عن مباشرة أو استمناء عالما بالتحريم ذاكرا. And however, whatever way that someone would ejaculate, by his own action, by his own act, either it's masturbation or it's like stroking one's genital, as long as he knows that this would validate his fast, as long as they know that this is impermissible, and as long as they would remember that they are fasting. That if they have committed any of what we have mentioned while forgetting that they are fasting, or while they don't know that this would invalidate their fasting, or they were forced to do that, they didn't do it deliberately, their fasting will be valid. وتلزمه لإفساد الصوم في رمضان بالجماع مع القضاء الكفارة. Now we have a special case for invalidating one's fast by having intercourse. Having intercourse is not like the other cases. The other cases, once who would break his fasting through these other cases, he would just has to make up that day, and he has to make tawbah. He has to make repentance to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ask Allah to forgive them. But the one who have sexual intercourse during the month of Ramadan, he has to make kafara, expiation. And that expiation is عتق رقبة مؤمنة. But first we have to be specific here that the fast that would require that expiation has to be having intercourse during the month of Ramadan, for someone who is fasting a day during the month of Ramadan. So this means that if someone would or someone is making up a fast that he has missed, and he had intercourse, sexual intercourse on that day, it is not mandated to make that kafara. The one who is mandated to make that kafara is the one who has broken his fasting through sexual intercourse during fasting the month of Ramadan. During fasting the month of Ramadan. So yeah, that expiation is عتق رقبة مؤمنة سليمة من العيوب المضرة بالكسب. So that one who has invalidated his fast through having sexual intercourse has to free a slave. That slave has to be a believing slave, a Muslim slave, and it also has to be free of the deficiencies that would make him unable to make living, to earn wealth that would make him afford his living. فإن لم يجد, they don't find slaves like we have nowadays, don't have slaves, then he has to fast شهرين متتابعين, 2 consecutive months. So the one who does so and he doesn't have any slaves to free, then they move on to the other type of expiation, which is fasting 2 consecutive months. They don't have to fast 60 days. He just has to fast 2 consecutive months, even if one of these months is 29 days. However, if he started from the mid of the month, he has to complete that month 30 days. فإن لم يستطع, if he is unable to fast these 60 days, فيطعم 60 مسكينا, then he has to feed 60 misfortunates, or 60 poor people, and by providing them with the food. And the amount that would suffice each of them is about 550 grams of food. It is not sufficient that they would just invite them to that food, rather they have to give the food to them. He has to provide them with the food, and they will do whatever they please with it. فَإِنْ عَجَزَ, if he doesn't afford that amount of food to give it in charity, ثبتت في ذمته, that it will be still as a debt that he has to do. He would be required to do it. Would be required to do this act of worship. ولا تجب على الموطوءة كفارة. But for the woman who had intercourse during the month of Ramadan while fasting, she doesn't have to make expiation. They would just have to make up that day. Why? Because she actually has broken her fasting before having sexual intercourse, because sexual intercourse is not called or does not happen or is not considered unless the head of the penis is entered into the vagina. However, a woman would break her fasting by just entering anything into the vagina. It doesn't have to enter the whole head of the penis, only even the tip of it. Once it reaches her vagina, she is now invalidated her fast. So she would invalidate her fast before having sexual intercourse. That is why she doesn't have to make that expiation that the man has to make. We're gonna stop here, insha'Allah ta'ala, and we're gonna continue next class bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.